Longdendale lies high in the Peak District near Glossop, where the Pennines narrow into a long valley of reservoirs, old railway lines and open moorland that seems to absorb both weather and silence. Even on clear days, there is something slightly remote about the place. The hills rise steeply above the water. The roads twist through dark stone cuttings, and beyond the last settlements, the land opens into the broad exposed heights of Bleaklow and Black Hill. It is a landscape that has always felt separate from the world beyond it, and perhaps because of that, stories have gathered here for centuries. The valley stretches eastward from Glossop towards Woodhead, following one of the oldest crossing points through the Pennines. Long before the modern roads and reservoirs appeared, people were already moving through these hills. Archaeological evidence across the high peak suggests long periods of prehistoric activity in the uplands, with routeways, grazing land, scattered earthworks, and traces of seasonal occupation surviving across the moors. Much of it now lies half hidden beneath peat, heather, and rough grassland, but enough remains to show that this country was never truly empty. Above the valley sits the earthwork known as Fireside Castle. Despite the name, it is not a medieval castle in the usual sense. Antiquarians once suggested it might be prehistoric, perhaps a burial mound or defensive feature, while more modern interpretations remain cautious about assigning it any definite purpose. Whatever its true origin, the mound has become woven into the folklore of Longdendale itself. Standing quietly above the reservoirs, while stories of lights and apparitions continue to collect around the surrounding hillsides. To the west stood the Roman fort of Melandra near Glossop. Roman roads once crossed eastward from the fort through difficult terrain, linking the western side of the Pennines with settlements further east. Even now, there are stretches of the moors where the landscape still feels ancient enough for such routes to linger in the imagination. Low cloud moves quickly here. Mist rolls across the slopes with little warning. Distances become deceptive. A figure glimpsed briefly on a ridge can vanish almost immediately into weather and shadow. It is perhaps not surprising that Longdendale became a place associated with strange sightings. For generations, there have been reports of unusual lights appearing over the valley and surrounding moors. These became known as the Longdendale Lights, though older traditions referred to them as the Devil's Bonfires. Witnesses have described isolated lights moving slowly across hillsides at night, sometimes white, sometimes orange, occasionally blue in colour. Some reports speak of single lights hovering motionless above the slopes, while others describe several appearing together before fading into the darkness. The stories long predate the internet and modern paranormal culture. Researchers such as David Clarke collected numerous local accounts during the late 20th century and approached them carefully, placing them within the wider tradition of British spook lights rather than immediately treating them as supernatural phenomena. Some explanations are practical enough. Vehicle headlights from the Woodhead Pass can refract strangely in poor weather conditions, particularly across mist and low cloud. Military activity has also taken place over parts of the Peak District, and there have been suggestions that some sightings may have involved distant aircraft or flares distorted by the landscape itself. Not every account fits comfortably into these explanations. Some witnesses described lights appearing in places where no road existed. Others reported movements difficult to reconcile with vehicles or aircraft. The uncertainty surrounding them is part of what keeps the story alive. Alongside the lights came the older tales of figures seen crossing the hills. One reoccurring tradition involves phantom Roman soldiers, said to move in formation across parts of the valley near ancient routeways. These accounts are impossible to verify historically, and many are vague in detail, but the stories have persisted for decades. In most cases, the witnesses describe dark figures appearing briefly through fog or low cloud, before disappearing entirely. Whether these experiences were caused by poor visibility, misidentification, or simple folklore attaching itself to an already ancient landscape is difficult to say. Longdendale has another lesser-known story too, one that sits somewhere between local folklore and possible historical truth. During the late Victorian period, there were reports of a strange man living alone on the moors above the valley. Later accounts described him as ragged, heavily bearded, and avoiding contact with local people whenever he was seen. Shepherds and travellers supposedly caught occasional glimpses of him moving across the hillsides, or disappearing into isolated parts of the moorland. Over time, the figure became known locally as the Wild Man of Longdendale. The difficulty with the story is that surviving evidence is limited. Later folklore collections and local retellings claim that concern eventually grew strong enough for local police and landowners to organise searches across the moors in an attempt to identify or capture the man. Though clear contemporary records for these searches remain elusive, it is entirely possible that the story grew from sightings of a genuine hermit or vagrant living rough in the hills before gradually becoming exaggerated through retelling. Victorian Britain produced many such stories. Rural newspapers regularly carried reports of mysterious recluses, wandering strangers, or supposed wild men seen in woods and isolated countryside. Longdendale, with its difficult terrain and remote farmsteads, would have been exactly the kind of landscape where rumours could spread quickly and facts becoming uncertain. What makes the story interesting is not necessarily whether the searches truly happened, but how naturally the legend attached itself to the valley. Longdendale has always carried an atmosphere of isolation. Even now, standing alone on the higher paths above the reservoirs, it is easy to understand how a solitary figure glimpsed briefly through rain or mist might quickly become something larger in local memory. The valley's reputation deepened further during the 20th century, following a series of genuine aircraft disasters across the surrounding moors. Bleaklow in particular became notorious for crashes during periods of poor visibility. Before modern navigation systems, pilots flying over the Pennines often relied on limited visual reference points while contending with rapidly changing weather conditions. The best known disaster occurred in November 1948, when a United States Air Force RB-29 Superfortress crashed into higher shelf stones on Bleaklow. All 13 crew members were killed. Fragments of the wreckage still remain scattered across the moor today, slowly weathering into the landscape itself. Walkers visiting the site often remark upon the silence surrounding it. The aluminium fragments lie amongst peat and heather beneath open sky, and the scale of the emptiness around the wreckage gives the place a strange stillness. Nothing about the site feels theatrical. The reality of what happened there is already enough. Over time, stories inevitably grew around the crashes. Walkers and motorists occasionally reported hearing aircraft engines overhead in poor visibility, without seeing any plane at all. Others claimed to glimpse low-flying aircraft vanishing suddenly into fog or cloud above the hills. Such reports are difficult to assess. Sound behaves unpredictably across valleys and moorland, and the Peak District still experiences military and civilian air traffic. Yet in a landscape already associated with lights, phantom figures and isolation, these experiences quickly become part of Longdendale's folklore. Then, in March 1997, one incident transformed the valley's reputation completely. On the evening of the 24th of March, several witnesses reported seeing what appeared to be a low-flying aircraft over the moors near Longdendale and Howden. Two women who had travelled into the area to observe the Hale-Bopp comet later stated that they saw an aircraft descending behind the hills, followed by what appeared to be an orange glow or flash. A local farmer also reported seeing a plane flying unusually low across the landscape. Shortly afterwards came reports of an explosion. Emergency services were contacted and a large-scale search operation began. Mountain rescue teams, police and RAF support searched the moors extensively through the night and into the following day. The search covered difficult terrain in poor conditions and became one of the largest operations of its kind in the area for many years. Yet despite the scale of the search, nothing was found. No wreckage, no impact site, no missing aircraft. The incident became widely known as the Longdendale Phantom plane crash. In the years that followed, the story gradually drifted into paranormal interpretation. Some later writers suggested that witnesses may somehow have seen a replay of an earlier crash, particularly the 1948 B-29 disaster on Bleaklow. Others connected the incident to the valley's existing stories of strange lights and unexplained activity. Later investigation by researcher David Clark approached the case much more cautiously. Through examination of official material and military activity records, he concluded that at least part of the incident may have been connected to a pre-arranged military exercise taking place in the region that evening. This explanation does not necessarily account for every detail reported by witnesses, but it places the incident on far firmer historical ground than many of the more dramatic paranormal claims that emerged afterwards. Even so, the case remains fascinating because of the way it merged almost instantly with Longdendale's older folklore. Within a very short time, a real emergency response involving multiple witnesses, rescue teams, and extensive searches became absorbed into a much older landscape tradition, already shaped by lights, phantom aircraft, Roman legends, and stories of strange figures crossing the moors. Longdendale is not a place dominated by one famous haunting. Its atmosphere comes instead from accumulation. Ancient routeways beneath modern roads, reservoirs covering older ground, wreckage slowly sinking into peat, isolated farmhouses standing alone beneath the hills, stories repeated quietly over generations until they become part of the landscape itself. Even the smaller accounts attached to the valley carry that same subdued quality. Walkers occasionally describe glimpsing figures on distant ridges that disappear moments later into fog. Others speak of lights moving slowly above the reservoirs before vanishing entirely. Some abandoned buildings in the area have reputations for uneasy atmospheres or unexplained sounds, though most such reports remain anecdotal and impossible to verify. Perhaps that uncertainty is what gives Longdendale its peculiar character. Very little here feels entirely fixed. The archaeology remains incomplete. The folklore shifts, depending on who tells it. Practical explanations exist for many of the sightings, but not always for every detail. The valley sits in that uneasy space where landscape, history, weather, and human perception overlap. And because of that, the stories continue. The lights are still occasionally reported moving across the hills after dark. Walkers still visit the old crash sites on Bleaklow. The reservoirs remain black and still beneath the surrounding moors. And somewhere among the older traditions of the valley, the story of the Victorian Wild Man still survives too. Half remembered and half uncertain, like so many other things attached to Longdendale itself. Thank you for listening to Ghost Tales by the Fireside. If you enjoy these stories, you can support the podcast and get access to MP3s over on Buy Me a Coffee. They're £1.50 each, or free if you're a member. You can also find everything at ghosttales.co.uk and follow on Facebook and Instagram at Ghost Tales Podcast.